The rain didn't just fall in the Bowery, it punished the pavement. Silas the Ghost Vane sat in the back of his armored SUV, the glowing tip of his cigar the only light in the cabin. He had 3 minutes to reach the docks before a $5 billion deal turned into a bloodbath. "Why are we stopping?" Silas's voice was a low, dangerous gravel. "Sir, there's a—" The driver stammered, his eyes glued to the windshield. "There's a kid." Silas leaned forward. Through the rhythmic slap of the wipers, he saw it. A tiny figure in a bright yellow raincoat, standing dead center in the flooded street. One small hand was raised, palm flat, a silent, absolute command to stop. The guards in the front seat shifted, hands moving toward their holsters. In their world, a child in the road wasn't an accident. It was a distraction for an ambush. Silas stepped out into the downpour, his heavy trench coat soaking instantly. He loomed over the toddler, a mountain of scarred muscle and expensive wool. "You're a long way from home, little one," he growled, the shadow of his hat hiding his eyes. "Move. Now." The child didn't flinch. While the most feared men in the city trembled at Silas's name, this girl looked at him with eyes that seemed decades too old. She pointed a small, muddy finger at the asphalt directly beneath the SUV's front tires. "No," she whispered, her voice piercing through the thunder. "You move. Back up. Now." "Give me one reason why I shouldn't have you moved myself," Silas threatened, stepping closer. The child leaned in, her hood falling back to reveal a calm, terrifying smile. "Because if you stay there for 10 more seconds, you won't live to see the sunrise." Silas stared into the girl's eyes, searching for a tremor of fear or a hint of a prank, but he found only an eerie, crystalline stillness. The rain hammered against his shoulders, a heavy, cold weight that usually grounded him, yet in this moment he felt untethered. He was a man who dealt in certainties, in cold hard cash and the brutal physics of power, but this child was an anomaly. She stood small and defiant, her yellow raincoat, a jagged tear of color, against the charcoal sky. Behind him, the engine of the SUV hummed, $5 billion of potential energy waiting to be unleashed at the docks, but the air around the girl felt charged with something far more volatile than money. 10 seconds, Silas," she whispered. Her voice shouldn't have been audible over the roar of the storm, yet it cut through the thunder like a razor through silk. He didn't know why he believed her. Perhaps it was the way she used his name, a name whispered in terror by grown men but never spoken by children. Perhaps it was the way she didn't blink as the lightning arced across the sky. Whatever it was, the instinct that had kept Silas alive through a decade of street wars screamed at him to move. "Reverse! Now!" Silas roared, lunging back toward the open door of the vehicle. The driver didn't hesitate. He slammed the gear into reverse, the tires screeching and splashing through the deep puddles as the heavy armored beast lurched backward. Silas barely managed to scramble inside, his boots skidding on the floor mats as he slammed the door shut. They moved 10 feet, then 20, the engine roaring in a desperate mechanical whine. Then the world turned white. A subterranean growl preceded the blast, a sound so deep it felt as though the earth's ribs were snapping. A split second later, the intersection, where they had just been idling, erupted. It wasn't a standard fireball. It was a focused, violent geyser of asphalt, concrete, and fire. A seismic charge, professionally planted in the junction of the sewer lines, had turned the street into a canyon. The shockwave hit the SUV like a physical fist, shoving the multi-ton vehicle back and shattering the reinforced glass into a web of spider cracks. Silas was thrown against the leather seat, the roar of the explosion ringing in his ears, drowning out the frantic shouts of his men. Debris rained down, chunks of the road, the size of tombstones, hammered against the roof. Through the smoke and the settling dust, Silas saw the crater. It was a jagged, smoking maw in the earth, exactly where his front tires had been resting moments before. Had they stayed, the armored plating would have meant nothing. The vehicle would have been folded in half, its occupants crushed instantly. The silence that followed was more deafening than the blast. Silas pushed the door open, his ears still whistling. The smell of ozone and burnt rubber filled the humid air. He ignored the frantic checks from his guards, stepping out into the mud. His heart, usually a steady, rhythmic drum, thrashed against his ribs. The $5 billion deal at the docks was a ghost now, a triviality compared to the smoking ruin in front of him. He looked toward the sidewalk where the girl had stood. The yellow raincoat was gone. The street was empty, save for the flickering orange glow of a ruptured gas line and the steady, indifferent rhythm of the rain. "Find her," Silas barked, his voice cracking the stunned silence of his crew. "Search every alley, every doorway." He paced toward the edge of the crater, his eyes scanning the ground. He didn't expect to find her, not really. She had moved with a ghost's grace. But as he reached the spot where she had stood with her hand raised, he stopped. Resting on a dry patch of concrete beneath a rusted shop awning was a small, polished object. Silas knelt, his large, scarred hand trembling slightly as he picked it up. It was a chess piece, a white pawn, carved from heavy ivory, cool to the touch. It was a humble piece, the lowliest on the board, yet it had just checkmated a king. He closed his fist around it, the sharp edges digging into his palm. The $5 billion deal was dead, but a new game had begun, one played by rules he didn't yet understand. He looked up at the dark skyline, the white pawn hidden in his grip, knowing that his life had changed in exactly 10 seconds. The ivory pawn felt like a frozen coal against Silas's palm as he stepped into the sanctuary of his stronghold, a brutalist fortress of steel and reinforced concrete that overlooked the city's jagged skyline. The air inside was climate-controlled and smelled of expensive leather and ozone, a sharp contrast to the sulfurous stench of the explosion he had left behind. His inner circle stood in the foyer, their faces pale reflections of the chaos on the news, but Silas didn't acknowledge them. He moved with a predatory focus toward the command center, his wet trench coat heavy, leaving a trail of rainwater across the polished marble floor. "Scrub the feeds," Silas commanded, his voice a low vibration that silenced the room. "Every camera within a 10-block radius of the intersection. I don't want a vehicle log or a facial match on the hitters. I want the girl in the yellow coat." His head of security, a man named Marcus who had served him for a decade, hesitated. "Sir, the port authorities are frantic. The $5 billion deal is in freefall. The partners are demanding a meeting to discuss the security breach." "Let them scream," Silas snapped, finally turning to look at Marcus. The cold fire in his eyes made the younger man flinch. That explosion wasn't an attempt to steal a shipment. It was a funeral pyre meant for me. If that child hadn't stood in the rain, we wouldn't be having this conversation because you'd be scraping me off the asphalt. Find her. For the next 4 hours, Silas sat in the darkness of the surveillance suite, the blue light of the monitors etching the deep lines of his face into sharp relief. He was a man who had built an empire on creative writing and the calculated thrill of risk, crafting narratives of power that kept his enemies in check. But the narrative had shifted to tonight. He watched the footage of the blast on loop, the way the ground heaved, the way the fire consumed the space where his heart should have been. As the digital analysts began to pull data from the city's vast eyes-in-the-sky network, the obsession took root. It wasn't just gratitude. It was the terrifying realization that he had been played. He began to cross-reference Maya's digital footprint, expanding the search parameters beyond tonight. If she was a ghost with a habit of haunting his rivals. "Sir, you need to see this," a technician whispered, her fingers flying across the haptic interface. The screen split into a dozen windows. In the first, dated 6 months prior, a high-ranking lieutenant of the Cavallo family was seen stepping out of a club moments before a freak electrical fire leveled the building. In the corner of the frame, partially obscured by a trash bin, was a flash of yellow. Silas leaned in, his breath hitching. In the second video, a bridge collapse that had claimed 3 armored trucks belonging to the Irish syndicate showed a small figure sitting on a park bench nearby, swinging her legs and clutching a teddy bear while the world tore itself apart behind her. Window after window opened, a gallery of accidents and unfortunate coincidences that had systematically thinned the ranks of the city's underworld. In every single one, Maya was there. She was a silent spectator at the theater of destruction, a golden thread woven into a tapestry of blood and high-stakes finance. Silas realized with a jolt of adrenaline that she wasn't just a child, she was an omen. He thought of the white pawn in his pocket. In the grand game of the city, he had always considered himself the king, or at least the hand that moved the pieces. But seeing her face, so small, so calm, appearing in the background of every major disaster, he felt a chilling sense of insignificance. She wasn't running from the chaos. She was anticipating it. The ghost shadow wasn't a nickname for Silas anymore. The real shadow was the little girl who knew where the bodies were buried before they were even dead. He looked at the screen, at the grainy image of her standing in the rain, and felt a pull stronger than the lure of $5 billion. He had to know who she was working for, or more terrifyingly, if she was working alone. The outskirts of the city were a graveyard of industry, where the skeletal remains of factories clawed at the charcoal sky. Silas sat in the back of a nondescript sedan, the white pawn spinning restlessly between his fingers as the vehicle bumped over the cracked asphalt of the old industrial district. He was far from the neon-soaked towers of his empire, entering a place where the rain didn't wash things clean. It only turned the soot into a thick black sludge. They pulled up to the iron gates of St. Jude's Home for Children, or what was left of it. The structure was a jagged silhouette of scorched brick and hollowed windows, a monument to a tragedy that the city had long since scrubbed from its ledger. Stepping out into the biting wind, Silas felt a phantom heat prickling at his skin. He didn't need the digital files his team had unearthed to tell him what happened here. The smell of cold ash and wet timber triggered a memory he had spent a decade trying to bury. He moved through the front entrance, his heavy boots crunching on shattered glass and charred floorboards. The interior was a labyrinth of shadows, the walls blackened by a fire so intense it had melted the very pipes in the walls. This was the Orphanage of Ash, a site of a random electrical fire that had claimed 22 lives 4 years ago. He reached the center of the ruins, a former common room where a rusted swing set stood eerily still in the center of the debris. Silas pulled out a flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom to rest on a section of the wall that had miraculously escaped the worst of the flames. There, beneath layers of grime, were the remnants of a mural, a sun, a tree, and a small, hand-painted yellow raincoat hanging from a peg. His breathing hitched. He pulled a weathered folder from his coat, flipping to the section titled The Rossi Family. Before Silas had consolidated power, before he was the ghost, he had been a soldier for the Rossi syndicate. The Rossis were old school, a family that believed in blood and loyalty until the night the internal coup tore them apart. The official report said the entire Rossi bloodline had been extinguished in a safe house hit. But the unofficial truth, the one Silas now held in his trembling hands, suggested otherwise. One child had been moved to St. Jude's under a false name just days before the massacre, Maya Rossi. Silas leaned against a soot-stained pillar, the weight of the realization pressing down on his chest. Maya wasn't just a girl with a knack for predicting disasters. She was the last living fragment of the family he had once sworn to protect, and the family he had watched burn. He remembered the night of the orphanage fire. He had been a rising lieutenant then, hearing whispers that a loose end was being tied up at St. Jude's. He had turned a blind eye, focused on his own climb to the throne. He had told himself it was just business, that the collateral damage of a syndicate war was the price of peace. Now that price was standing in the middle of a rainy street, ordering him to move. He scanned the room again, his light falling on a small, hidden alcove beneath the stairs. Inside was a tiny nest made of scorched blankets and silver foil. It wasn't 4 years old. It was fresh. Someone had been living here, among the ghosts and the charcoal. In the center of the makeshift bed lay a matching ivory piece, a white queen. The girl wasn't just surviving, she was haunting the site of her own murder. Silas realized Maya didn't just see the math of the world, she saw the sins of the men who ran it. She knew exactly who Silas was. She knew that the man she had saved from the $5 billion trap was the same man who had allowed her world to turn to ash. He wasn't her hero, he was her penance. The wind howled through the empty window frames, sounding like a chorus of whispers. Silas closed his eyes, seeing the flash of the yellow raincoat in the darkness. She had saved his life not out of love, but because her game wasn't finished. A pawn can only move forward, but a queen has the power to strike from any direction. As he tucked the white queen into his pocket next to the pawn, Silas knew he was no longer the player. He was the target, and the ghost was finally being haunted by a spirit he had helped create. The penthouse office was a tomb of glass and brushed steel, perched so high that the lightning from the ongoing storm seemed to strike level with the floor-to-ceiling windows. Silas sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of obsidian, the two ivory chess pieces, the pawn and the queen, resting on the dark surface like bone fragments. He had spent 48 hours dissecting the history of the Rossi family, retracing the bloodlines he had helped sever, and the weight of that guilt was a physical pressure in the room. He was surrounded by biometric scanners, armed sentries, and pressure-sensitive floors, yet he felt more vulnerable than he had in the middle of the street. The heavy mahogany doors didn't creak when they opened. They swung wide with a deliberate, haunting slowness. Silas's hand moved instinctively toward the drawer where he kept a suppressed pistol, but his fingers froze when he saw the small figure standing in the doorway. Maya wasn't wearing the yellow raincoat now. She wore a simple, clean dress of pale blue, her hair brushed back, looking less like a street urchin and more like the ghost of the princess she was born to be. Behind her, Silas could see his two lead security details, men trained in elite military tactics, standing perfectly still. They weren't unconscious or restrained. They simply stood with their heads bowed, their eyes glazed as if they were deep in prayer or a trance. They hadn't fought her. They had stepped aside as if she were the rightful owner of the building. "They didn't try to stop me, Silas," Maya said, her voice small but filling every corner of the vast room. She walked toward his desk, her footsteps making no sound on the expensive carpet. "They remember the name Rossi. Deep down, in the parts of their souls they try to hide from you, they know who I am." Silas didn't call for backup. He knew his men wouldn't answer. "How did you get past the biometrics, Maya?" The girl reached the desk and looked down at the ivory pieces. She picked up the pawn, rolling it between her small fingers just as he had done. "The machines look for threats. I am not a threat to the building. I am only a threat to the lie you've built." She looked up, her gaze pinning him to his chair. "You saved me once, years ago. You looked the other way when the fire started, but you moved the bolt on the back door just enough for a small girl to slip through. Did you think I forgot?" Silas felt the air leave his lungs. He had never told a soul about that moment of weakness or mercy. It was the one secret he had kept from the syndicate, the one crack in his armor. Maya reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound folder. She laid it on the obsidian desk. It was the $5 billion merger contract, the document that would finalize his takeover of the city's infrastructure and cement his legacy as the undisputed king of the underworld. He had signed it an hour ago. "You have to move again, Silas," she said softly. "I can't walk away from this," Silas rasped, his voice sounding thin even to his own ears. "This deal is the only thing keeping the other families from starting a full-scale war. It's the only way to keep the peace." "It is a contract written in the ash of St. Jude's," Maya countered, her eyes flashing with a sudden, cold intensity. "The men you are signing with are the ones who paid for the fire. If you sign this, you aren't a king. You are their janitor, cleaning up the blood they leave behind. Is that the legacy of the ghost?" She leaned forward, her tiny shadow stretching across the desk until it touched his chest. "Burn the contract. That is my order." "And if I don't?" Silas asked, the same question he had posed in the rain. "Then the math will complete itself," she replied, her voice devoid of malice, carrying only the weight of an inevitable truth. "The gas lines under this building are already vibrating. The men in the lobby are already checking their watches. If that ink stays dry on that paper, this tower becomes your monument in 10 minutes. Move, Silas, or burn with the rest of them." Silas looked at the $5 billion document, then at the girl who shouldn't exist. He picked up his gold-plated lighter. The flame flickered, a tiny, dancing orange spark reflecting in Maya's unblinking eyes. With a hand that didn't tremble, he touched the flame to the corner of the heavy parchment. The fire took hold instantly, a hungry blue and orange glow that began to consume the signatures and the seals. As the scent of burning paper filled the office, Maya smiled. It was a terrifyingly beautiful expression of relief. "Good," she whispered. "Now we go. The back door is still unlocked, Silas, just like last time." The charred remains of the $5 billion merger sat in a silver tray on Silas's desk, a pile of gray flakes that represented the total collapse of the city's underworld hierarchy. Outside the obsidian walls of his office, the silence was more violent than gunfire. Silas stood by the window, watching the rain wash over the city he no longer controlled, while Maya sat in his high-backed leather chair, her feet dangling inches above the floor. She was focused on a bowl of cherries, pits accumulating on a napkin like small dark trophies. To any observer, it was a domestic scene. To Silas's lieutenants, it was the end of the world. The rebellion didn't start with a coup. It started with a question. Marcus, Silas's most trusted enforcer, entered the room without a knock, his face a mask of restrained fury. Behind him stood 4 other captains, men who had spent years as the iron fist of the Vane family. They looked at the empty desk, then at the girl sitting in the seat of power, and finally at Silas. The air in the room was thick with the scent of ozone and betrayal. "The partners are pulling out, Silas," Marcus said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "The Irish are arming their docks, and Cavallo is already moving on our northern territories. All because you burned the bridge to the greatest fortune this city has ever seen. Because of her." He pointed a trembling finger at Maya, who didn't even look up from her cherries. "The men are talking. They say the ghost has finally seen a spirit he can't haunt. They say you've lost your mind to a child's ghost stories." Silas didn't turn around. "The deal was a shroud, Marcus. We were signing our own death warrants. She saw it when we were blind." "She's a toddler," Marcus roared, his composure finally snapping. "She's a stray you picked up in the rain, and now she's dictating the fate of a multi-billion-dollar empire. Either you put her out on the street and call a meeting with Cavallo tonight, or the family finds a new head. We won't follow a man who takes orders from a nursery." Maya finally looked up. She picked up a cherry, held it to the light, and spoke without a hint of fear. "Marcus likes the color red," she said softly. "That's why he met with Cavallo's nephew at the Red Lantern 3 nights ago. That's why he has a suitcase packed in the trunk of his car, parked in the basement of the hotel across the street." The room went tomb quiet. Marcus froze, the blood draining from his face until his skin matched the gray ash in the tray. The other captains shifted their gaze toward him, their hands twitching near their holsters. The little general hadn't raised her voice, but she had just fired the first shot in a silent war. "She's lying," Marcus hissed, but the sweat beading on his forehead told a different story. "Silas, don't listen to this." "The suitcase is under the spare tire," Maya continued, her voice clinical and detached. "It contains $2 million in cash and a flight manifest for Bogota. He wasn't going to help you fight Cavallo. He was the one who told them where to plant the seismic charge at the intersection. He wanted the $5 billion, but he wanted you dead even more." Silas finally turned. He didn't look at Marcus. He looked at Maya. She was the one who had seen the math of the betrayal, the tiny patterns of hushed phone calls and shifted schedules that led to the attempted assassination. He saw the truth in Marcus's eyes, a frantic, cornered look that confirmed every word. Silas moved with a speed that belied his size, his hand closing around Marcus's throat before the man could draw his weapon. "You were my brother," Silas whispered, his voice more terrifying than a scream. I followed a king," Marcus gasped, clawing at Silas's iron grip. "I won't follow a ghost." Silas didn't kill him. He threw him toward the other captains. "Take him. Check the car. If she's right, he belongs to the streets. If she's wrong, I'll step down myself." The captains dragged a struggling Marcus from the room, leaving Silas alone with the girl once more. The news of the encounter spread through the city like a virus. The shock was no longer just about the explosion. It was the realization that the most feared man in the city had a new advisor. In the high-stakes creative writing of the underworld, the narrative had flipped. The ghost was no longer the author of his own story. He was the primary character in a play directed by a child in a blue dress. Maya stood up and walked to the window, placing a small hand on the glass. "The war has started, Silas," she said, watching the headlights of his departing captains. "But don't worry, I've already moved the pieces. You just have to be ready to strike when I tell you." Silas looked at the ivory queen on his desk. He realized then that he wasn't protecting her. She was the only thing protecting him. He sat down in the chair she had just vacated, feeling the fading warmth of her presence. The silent war had begun, and for the first time in his life, Silas Vane knew he couldn't lose, not as long as he obeyed the little general. The penthouse was saturated in a heavy, expectant silence that felt more oppressive than the rain-slicked streets 50 stories below. Silas stood by the obsidian desk, his large frame casting a long shadow that seemed to swallow the room's ambient light. He watched Maya, who was currently sitting on the floor, meticulously arranging a set of silver fountain pens into a geometric pattern. To the world, she was the Little General, a mystical oracle who had dismantled a $5 billion conspiracy with a whisper. To Silas, she was a haunting enigma, a living ghost from the Rossi family's ashes that he had spent his life trying to outrun. "Enough, Maya," Silas said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "The city thinks you're a prophet. My men think you're a curse. I need to know the truth. How did you know about the bomb? How did you know about Marcus's suitcase? No more riddles. No more ghost stories." Maya didn't look up immediately. She nudged a pen a fraction of an inch to the left, completing a perfect hexagonal shape. When she finally lifted her gaze, Silas saw a profound weariness in her eyes, a weight that no child should ever carry. She looked at him not with the innocence of a toddler, but with the clinical detachment of an architect surveying a crumbling foundation. "There is no magic in the world, Silas," she said softly, her voice sounding older than the room itself. "There is only the math. Most people see the world as a series of accidents. Rain falls, cars drive, people lie. But I see the patterns. I see the way everything touches everything else." She stood up and walked toward the massive glass window, placing her palm against the reinforced pane. "When we were in the street, you heard the rain and the thunder. I heard the hum of the city. Everything has a frequency. The seismic charge they used was a low-vibration timer. It was singing to the pavement. I didn't see the future. I heard the countdown. I felt the rhythm of the ticking through the soles of my feet. It was a dissonant note in the music of the street. It didn't belong." Silas walked toward her, his brow furrowed in a mix of awe and horror. He had spent his career as a master of creative writing, crafting narratives of power and thrill to manipulate the underworld, but Maya was reading the very code of reality. "And Marcus?" Silas asked. "The suitcase? The red lantern?" "People are the easiest math of all," Maya replied, her breath fogging the glass. "Marcus changed his stride 3 weeks ago. He started favoring his left side because he was carrying the weight of a burner phone in his pocket. He stopped looking you in the eye because the guilt changed the pitch of his voice. He smelled of the expensive sandalwood soap they only use at the Red Lantern. Every lie has a sound, Silas. Every betrayal has a scent. You just have to listen." She turned away from the window, her small face pale in the flickering lightning. "It isn't a gift. It's a burden. I can't turn it off. I hear the bridge cables fraying before they snap. I see the micro-expressions on a man's face that tell me he's going to pull a trigger 5 seconds before his brain even makes the decision. I saw the fire at St. Jude's coming too. I heard the sparks in the wiring for days. I tried to tell them, but they thought I was just a difficult child." Silas felt a cold stone of guilt drop into his stomach. He realized that her vision wasn't a superpower. It was a hyper-awareness born from a mind that could never find rest. She was a genius trapped in a world of chaotic, violent variables. She wasn't an oracle. She was a survivor who had been forced to calculate her way out of a grave he had helped dig. "I'm sorry," Silas whispered, the words feeling inadequate against the scale of her isolation. "Don't be sorry," Maya said, stepping toward him and reaching out to touch the white pawn resting on his desk. "Just listen to me. The math is getting louder, Silas. The other families aren't just angry about the 5 billion. They're afraid of what they don't understand. They're moving now. I can hear the engines starting across the river. The pattern is closing in." Silas looked at the small girl who saw the world in vibrations and frequencies. He had spent his life being the ghost, but Maya was the one truly haunted by the truth. He realized then that he couldn't just use her to win a war. He had to protect the girl who could see everything but could never close her eyes. The silence following Maya's revelation about the math of the world was shattered not by an explosion, but by the frantic chime of a high-priority alert on Silas's obsidian desk. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy thermal feed of the penthouse's private elevator bay. Silas watched, his blood turning to ice, as four shadows moved with surgical precision. They didn't use explosives or brute force. They used a frequency jammer that mimicked the building's own security bypass codes. It was a move so calculated, so quiet, that it could only have been choreographed by someone who had been studying the patterns as closely as Maya did. Before Silas could reach for the ivory queen on his desk, the heavy mahogany doors hissed open. A flashbang grenade rolled across the carpet, detonating in a blinding roar of white light and pressurized air. Silas stumbled, his vision a fractured mosaic of gold and black, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the storm outside. Through the haze, he saw a figure in a tactical mask scoop Maya up from the floor. She didn't scream. She didn't struggle. She simply looked back at Silas with an expression of heartbreaking resignation, as if she had already heard the frequency of this betrayal hours ago. By the time the smoke cleared and Silas had regained his footing, the office was empty. The little general was gone. "Trace that signal!" Silas roared into his comms, his voice cracking with a raw, visceral emotion his men had never heard before. For the first time in a career built on being the predator, Silas Vane felt the cold, suffocating grip of true fear. It wasn't the fear of losing his empire or the $5 billion fortune. It was the terror of a man who had finally found something worth loving, only to watch it be snatched into the dark. Within 20 minutes, a message appeared on his secure line. It was a live video feed from an undisclosed location, a cold, industrial basement lit by flickering fluorescent tubes. In the center of the frame sat Don Cavallo, the aging patriarch of the city's most brutal crime family. He was leaning over Maya, who sat perfectly still in a wooden chair, her blue dress a sharp contrast to the grime of her surroundings. "You look tired, Silas," Cavallo said, his voice a rasping growl that carried the smugness of a man who had finally won. "You were so distracted by the accidents and the failed merger that you forgot the oldest rule of the game. You never let your queen stand unprotected on an open board." Silas gripped the edge of his desk so hard the obsidian threatened to crack. "If you touch her, Cavallo, there won't be enough left of your family to bury." Cavallo laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "I don't want to kill her, Silas. I want to use her. My men told me about the math. They told me she hears the world before it happens. Do you have any idea what a man like me can do with a weapon that never misses? I didn't care about the $5 billion. That deal was a decoy, a shiny toy to keep your ghost eyes busy while I reached into your house and took the only thing that actually mattered." The realization hit Silas like a physical blow. The seismic charge at the intersection, the rebellion of his lieutenants, the pressure on his territories, it had all been a synchronized performance designed to isolate him. Cavallo hadn't been fighting a war for territory. He had been conducting a heist for a mind. He had lured Silas into a defensive crouch so he could steal the girl who could see the future. "She isn't a weapon," Silas rasped, his eyes fixed on Maya. She looked into the camera, her gaze steady, her lips moving silently, as if she were counting the hertz of the flickering lights in the room. "Everything is a weapon if you hold it correctly," Cavallo countered. He leaned in closer to Maya, his shadow engulfing her. "She's going to tell me exactly where your remaining shipments are. She's going to tell me which of my captains are planning to move against me. And in return, maybe I'll let you live long enough to watch me build an empire that makes yours look like a lemonade stand." The feed cut to black, leaving Silas in a room that suddenly felt far too large and far too cold. He looked down at the white pawn still resting on his desk. He was a man who had built a life on creative writing and the thrill of the hunt, but the story had turned into a nightmare. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have his little general to guide his hand. He only had the ivory piece in his fist and a burning, singular need to tear the city apart until he found the girl who had ordered a ghost to live. Silas didn't call for his captains, and he didn't wait for the remnants of his shattered organization to mobilize. The empire he had built on a foundation of creative writing and calculated thrill was nothing more than a hollow shell now, a collection of glass towers and blood-stained ledgers that meant less than the ivory pawn in his pocket. He stripped off his expensive, tailored suit, replacing it with the heavy, utilitarian gear of a man who had forgotten he was a king and remembered he was a soldier. He armed himself with the cold, mechanical precision of a predator who had nothing left to lose. The city roared outside, but for Silas, the only sound that mattered was the remembered frequency of Maya's voice. Cavallo's compound was a sprawling industrial fortress on the edge of the river, a place where the concrete was thick and the shadows were deep. It was guarded by men who believed in the safety of numbers, but they had never hunted a ghost. Silas moved through the outer perimeter like a violent wind. He didn't use the front gates. He came from the dark water, rising from the river like a vengeful spirit. The first guard fell before he could even register the ripple in the rain, a silent strike that left no room for a scream. Silas wasn't fighting for territory or for the $5 billion he had burned. He was fighting for the only light that had ever dared to shine in his dark world. The war he waged was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. He used the very patterns Maya had taught him to see: the rhythm of the patrol's footsteps, the hum of the electric fences, the predictable hesitation of men who were used to being the bullies. He moved through the shipping containers and the rusted warehouses, a silhouette of vengeance that left a trail of disarmed and broken men in his wake. Every flash of muzzle fire was a signature on a death warrant he had written for Cavallo. He ignored the burning pain of a grazing bullet on his shoulder, the adrenaline masking the fatigue that should have claimed him hours ago. He was a man possessed, a force of nature driven by a singular, desperate fear that the math of the world had finally turned against him. By the time Silas reached the heavy steel doors of the inner sanctum, his gear was soaked in rain and hydraulic fluid, his breathing a jagged rasp. He kicked the doors open, expecting to find a scene of torture or a standoff that would end in a bloodbath. He expected to see Cavallo holding a gun to the girl's head, using her as a shield for his cowardice. Instead, the scene that met him was so surreal it stopped him in his tracks, his weapon lowering as his mind struggled to process the reality of the room. Maya was sitting at a long, scarred wooden table in the center of the room. She wasn't tied up and she wasn't crying. In front of her sat a half-eaten sandwich and a glass of water. Don Cavallo was nowhere to be seen, but his elite personal guard, men known for their sadistic loyalty and cold hearts, were standing around the room. Their weapons weren't pointed at Maya. They were resting on the floor or leaning against the walls. Two of the men were sitting on crates, their heads in their hands, while another was staring out the window with an expression of profound, soul-deep realization. "Silas," Maya said, her voice clear and calm, cutting through the heavy tension of the industrial space. She didn't look surprised to see him covered in the grime of battle. "You're late. I told them you'd be here at 3:14 a.m. It's 3:16. The rain slowed you down by 2 minutes." "Maya?" Silas croaked, his voice cracking. He looked at the guards, his fingers twitching toward his trigger. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," she replied, hopping down from the chair. She walked toward him, her small blue dress clean and unruffled. "I just told them the math. I told them about the families they haven't called in years. I told the man by the door that the frequency of his heartbeat says he's going to have a stroke in 3 months unless he stops working for men who make him breathe poison. I told them that the floor they are standing on was built with cheap concrete that's vibrating at a fatal resonance." One of the guards, a scarred veteran Silas recognized as Cavallo's chief enforcer, looked up. His eyes were wet. "She knew my mother's middle name, Silas. She knew the sound of the wind in the trees the night I decided to become a monster. How can we fight something that knows us better than we know ourselves?" The little general reached Silas and took his large, bloodied hand in her small one. Cavallo ran Silas. He heard the math, too, and it told him that his empire was a house of cards. He's gone, but the men decided they didn't want to play the game anymore. Silas looked down at the child who had won a war without firing a single shot. He realized then that his rescue hadn't been for her. She had never been in danger. The rescue was for him, to show him that the ghost didn't need to be a killer to be powerful. He picked her up, burying his face in her shoulder as the adrenaline finally collapsed into a weary, overwhelming relief. The Empire was gone, but the girl was safe, and for the first time, the math of his life finally added up. The rain had stopped, leaving the city in a humid, suffocating grip that felt like a final breath. Silas stood in the heart of his command center, the ivory queen and pawn resting side by side on the obsidian desk for the very last time. He looked at the monitors, which were no longer displaying surveillance feeds or stock tickers, but the countdown of a system he had designed to erase himself from existence. He had spent his life building a throne out of shadows, but he realized now that a throne was just a target, and as long as he sat upon it, Maya would never be anything more than a prize for the next monster to hunt. He moved through the office with a heavy, deliberate pace, planting the final charges. These weren't the seismic devices of his enemies. They were precision thermite packs designed to turn steel into liquid and digital drives into ash. To save the girl who saw the math of the world, he had to prove that even the most calculated patterns could be broken by a single, irrational act of love. He was going to give the underworld exactly what it expected, a violent, spectacular ending for the ghost. Maya stood by the glass window, watching the flickering lights of the city she had spent her short life predicting. She didn't look at the explosives or the timers. She looked at Silas, her eyes reflecting the red glow of the arming lights. She knew the plan. She knew that in 60 minutes, the world would believe that Silas Vane and the Rossi heiress had perished in a vengeful strike by the remnants of the Cavallo family. They would become ghosts in truth, drifting into the white noise of a world that would stop looking for them. "The resonance of the building is changing, Silas," she said softly. "The structure knows it's about to fall. It sounds like a bell that has already been struck." Silas knelt in front of her, his hands, scarred from a lifetime of creative writing in blood and steel, trembling as he adjusted the small, nondescript coat she now wore. "Once the fire starts, there is no coming back, Maya. The Vane Empire dies tonight. The $5 billion deals, the high-security towers, the fear, it all turns to smoke. You won't be a general anymore. You won't have to hear the timers or the lies for the men who want to own you. You'll just be a child." "I was never just a child, Silas," she replied, reaching out to touch the scar on his jaw. "And you were never just a ghost. You were a man who moved when I told him to." He looked at her, the weight of his sacrifice pressing down on him. He was destroying everything he had ever built, abandoning the only identity he had ever known. He was prepared to walk into the flames to ensure she never had to see another explosion or calculate another betrayal. He felt the cold finality of the moment, the terrifying thrill of a story ending so that a new one could begin. "We have to go," Silas rasped, checked his watch. "The decoy is set. The basement is already flooding with gas. When the spark hits, the city will feel the shockwave for miles. They'll find your yellow raincoat in the debris. They'll find my signet ring. They'll find exactly what they need to stop searching." He picked her up, her small weight a grounding force against the chaos he was about to unleash. He headed toward the service elevator, the one secret exit that even Maya's math hadn't revealed until he showed it to her. But as he reached the threshold, Maya gripped his collar, her eyes burning with an intensity that stopped his heart. "Silas, listen to the math one last time," she whispered, her voice a sharp command. "You think this is the end because you're tired. You think the only way to save me is to disappear. But the patterns don't stop just because the building falls. The world will still be loud. The rain will still fall." She leaned in, her forehead pressing against his. "You want to die with the ghost so I can be free. But a girl like me needs a man who knows how to walk through the dark. You can't just protect me from the flames. You have to teach me how to build something that won't burn." She pulled back, her gaze absolute. "This is my final order, Silas Vane. You don't get to fade away. You don't get to let the ghost win. My order is, live." Silas felt the words strike him harder than the coming blast. It wasn't an order to survive. It was an order to begin. He nodded, a single sharp movement, and stepped into the elevator. Seconds later, the penthouse erupted in a blinding pillar of fire that turned the night into day. The empire was gone, but as Silas stepped out into the cold, wet air of the alleyway, he wasn't looking back at the ruins. He was looking forward, a white pawn in his pocket and a living queen in his arms, finally ready to see what happened next. The skyline of the city was a jagged tooth of broken glass and cooling embers, a monument to a kingdom that had vanished in a single, roaring heartbeat. In the weeks that followed the destruction of the Vane headquarters, the underworld fell into a stunned, hollow silence. The shock that had gripped the streets wasn't just about the loss of $5 billion or the physical collapse of a fortress. It was the psychological erasure of a legend. Silas, the ghost Vane, was officially dead, his signet ring recovered from the slag, and the mysterious little general was presumed to be a cinder in the wind. The creative writing of the newspapers described it as a tragic end to a violent era. But for those who knew the math of the shadows, it felt like the world had simply stopped making sense. 1,000 miles away, the air didn't smell of sulfur and wet asphalt. It smelled of salt spray and blooming jasmine. The roar of the city had been replaced by the rhythmic, ancient breathing of the Atlantic Ocean. In a small, seaside town where the houses were painted in shades of weathered driftwood and seafoam green, the name Silas Vane had never been whispered. Here, time didn't move in 10-second warnings or tactical windows. It moved with the tides. A man walked down a narrow cobblestone path that led toward a small, sun-bleached elementary school. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, though the predatory tension that once defined his shoulders had softened into something steadier, more grounded. He wore a simple linen shirt and worn work boots. His large, scarred hands, once used to grip obsidian desks and cold steel, now carried a small lunchbox decorated with colorful planets. He looked remarkably like the ghost, but the cold fire in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, watchful peace. He was no longer a man haunting a city. He was a man finally inhabiting his own skin. As the school bell rang, a clear, melodic sound that carried no hidden frequencies of danger, the front doors swung open. A swarm of children spilled out into the afternoon light, their laughter a chaotic, beautiful symphony. In the center of the crowd, a flash of bright color appeared. It was a yellow raincoat, worn despite the cloudless blue sky, a stubborn relic of a past life that had become a comfort rather than a disguise. Maya ran toward him, her pigtails bouncing, her face lit by a smile that contained no hidden calculations. She didn't look for patterns in the sand or listen for the hum of distant threats. She wasn't a general surveying a battlefield. She was a 7-year-old girl who had finished her spelling test and wanted to go for ice cream. When she reached him, she didn't give an order. She simply leaped into his arms, her small hands locking around his neck with a fierce, uncomplicated love. "You're exactly on time," she whispered into his ear, her voice lacking the haunting weight of the Rossi legacy. "I didn't want to miss the math of the afternoon," the man replied, his voice a low, warm rumble as he tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. They walked away from the school, hand in hand, two figures silhouetted against the shimmering gold of the setting sun. Behind them, the ivory pawn and queen sat on a mantelpiece in a small cottage by the shore, no longer pieces in a game of blood and power, but merely souvenirs of a war that had been won by walking away. The $5 billion deals and the seismic charges were a lifetime ago, a story written by men who didn't understand the value of a quiet life. As they reached the edge of the water, Maya stopped and looked up at him. For a fleeting second, that old, knowing clarity returned to her eyes, the genius that saw the invisible threads of the world. She squeezed his hand and looked out at the horizon, where the sea met the sky in a perfect, unbroken line. "The resonance is perfect today, Silas," she said softly. He didn't ask her what she meant. He didn't need to. He just looked down at the girl who had ordered a ghost to live, and he realized that the math had finally reached its ultimate conclusion. They weren't legends, they weren't weapons, and they certainly weren't ghosts. They were just family, and for the first time in either of their lives, that was more than enough. The story of the little general was over, and the story of Maya and her father had finally quietly begun.